Welcome back to our series on the 50 studies every neonatologist should know. I'm Dr. Adnan Hadid, and today we're looking at study number 18, the HIPERSPACE trial. This is a study about high-flow nasal cannulae, or HFNC, in very preterm infants, right after they come off the ventilator. It's one of the first true non-inferiority trials in the neonatal literature, which makes it interesting both for what it found and for how it was designed. Over the next few minutes, we'll walk through the question it asked, how it was run, what the numbers showed, and where the field went afterward. Let's get started. Every study in this series opens with a line that captures its spirit, and this one comes straight from the trialists themselves. Manley and colleagues concluded that if you have both high-flow nasal cannulae and nasal CPAP available at the bedside, it seems reasonable to reach for high-flow first after extubation. Notice how measured that language is. They're not saying high flow is better. They're saying it's a reasonable choice. That restraint is the whole story of this trial, and it's a deliberate feature of how the study was built. Keep that word reasonable in mind as we go, because a non-inferiority trial is designed to answer exactly that kind of question. Let's turn to the research question itself. Let's frame the question in PICO terms. The population is very preterm infants, under 32 weeks gestation, who've been on a ventilator and are judged ready to come off. The intervention is high-flow nasal cannula, delivered at 5 to 8 liters per minute. The comparison is the long-standing standard, nasal CPAP at 6 to 8 centimeters of water. And the outcome that matters most is reintubation within 7 days. So the question boils down to this. After we pull the tube, is high flow a good enough alternative to CPAP to keep these babies from needing the tube back? Note the word alternative. Nobody expected high flow to be dramatically better. The real question was whether it's close enough to be a legitimate option. With that question in mind, let's look at why it needed answering. Why did this trial need to happen? Because practice was running ahead of the evidence. By around 2010, many units had already begun using high-flow nasal cannula after extubation. It's simpler to set up than CPAP, and babies and nurses both tend to tolerate it better. But there was a gap. Very little solid trial evidence actually confirmed that high-flow could keep these fragile babies off the ventilator as reliably as CPAP. Meanwhile, CPAP carries real costs of its own. The prongs and masks press on tiny noses and cause skin erosion and even pressure necrosis. So the stakes were practical. If high flow could hold its own, it might give comparable respiratory support with meaningfully better comfort and less nasal trauma. That's the gap HIPERSPACE set out to fill. Let's see how they designed it. Here's the design at a glance. The trial ran from 2010 and was published in 2013 across 3 centers in Australia. They enrolled 303 infants, just over their target of 300. It was a randomized controlled trial, but with 2 important features. First, it was unmasked. Caregivers knew which support each baby was getting, and we'll come back to why that matters. Second, and this is the key design choice, it was a non-inferiority trial. That target of 300 infants gave them 87% power to test whether high flow stayed within 20 percentage points of CPAP's failure rate. They also stratified randomization by gestational age group, under 26 versus 26 weeks and up, and by center to keep the arms balanced. Now let's look at exactly who was studied. Let's be specific about who was in this trial. The infants included were very preterm, born before 32 weeks, on mechanical ventilation, and judged by their team to be ready for extubation. That's the population where this decision actually comes up at the bedside. On the exclusion side, they left out babies whose post-menstrual age was over 36 weeks at the time of extubation, since they're a different physiologic group. They also excluded infants with major congenital anomalies, and any baby who wasn't receiving full intensive care, because withdrawing or limiting care changes the picture entirely. So this is a clean, focused population of genuinely preterm babies at the moment of coming off the ventilator. Now, what were they actually randomized to receive? The design is refreshingly simple. At the moment of extubation, each baby was randomized to one of 2 arms. On the left, the standard of care, nasal CPAP at 6 to 8 centimeters of water. Importantly, this group could also receive non-synchronized nasal intermittent positive pressure ventilation, or NIPPV, at any time. On the right, the intervention under test, high-flow nasal cannula at 5 to 8 liters per minute. In either arm, if a baby struggled, the team could escalate. High-flow babies could move up to CPAP or NIPPV, and from there to reintubation if truly needed. Weaning off support was allowed once a baby had been stable for more than 24 hours on minimal settings with oxygen requirements under 30%. So it mirrors real practice with clear rules. Now for the outcomes they tracked. The endpoints keep the same clean focus. The primary outcome was a single, hard, clinically meaningful event, intubation within 7 days. In other words, did the baby stay off the ventilator, or did we have to put the tube back in? That's the outcome that drives everything at the bedside. The secondary outcomes filled in the safety and burden picture: death, pneumothorax, how long each baby needed respiratory support, length of hospital stay, and nasal trauma. That last one matters because reducing nasal injury is one of the main reasons people want to use high flow in the first place. Babies were followed all the way through to hospital discharge, so this wasn't just a snapshot of the first few days. Now let's get to the results. Here are the headline numbers. In the high-flow arm, 34.2% of babies failed their assigned support. In the CPAP arm, 25.8% failed. So on the face of it, more high-flow babies needed to escalate. The risk difference was 8.4 percentage points, with a 95% confidence interval running from -1.9 to 18.7. The key point is that this confidence interval stayed under the pre-specified 20% margin, and it crossed zero. That's what non-inferiority looks like. Two other findings matter. First, most failures in both arms came from persistent apnea, not from the type of support, which tells you the mode wasn't the limiting factor. And second, apart from meaningfully less nasal trauma in the high-flow group, the secondary outcomes were essentially the same. Let's visualize that comparison. Sometimes a picture makes the point faster than numbers. Here are the two failure rates side by side. CPAP on the left in navy at 25.8%. High flow on the right in teal at 34.2%. You can see the high flow bar is taller, so yes, more of those babies needed to escalate. But look at the gap in context. The absolute difference is 8.4 percentage points. And the whole reason this counts as a win for high flow is that the pre-specified margin of acceptability was 20%. The observed difference and its confidence interval sat comfortably inside that boundary. This is the visual heart of a non-inferiority trial. You're not looking for the new bar to be shorter. You're checking that it doesn't rise too far above the standard. It didn't. Now, let's be honest about the study's weaknesses. No study is perfect, and this one has real limitations worth naming. First, it was unblinded. Caregivers knew which support each baby was on, and because the decision to escalate or de-escalate was left to physician judgment, that creates room for both performance and detection bias. Second, the non-inferiority margin. The authors themselves admit the 20% boundary was fairly generous and chosen somewhat arbitrarily. A wider margin makes non-inferiority easier to declare. Third, and this is important, the trial was underpowered for the smallest babies. In infants under 26 weeks, only 62 of them, the risk difference was 20% in favor of CPAP. So we genuinely cannot say high flow is safe as first-line support in that group. And finally, about half of the high-flow failures were simply rescued by CPAP without ever needing reintubation, which softens what failure really means here. Let's see how the field responded. So where did the field go from here? In 2013, HIPERSPACE established high flow as non-inferior to CPAP for support after extubation. But the same investigators then asked a harder question. In 2016, the Hypster trial tested high flow as primary respiratory support before any intubation, and there, high flow came out inferior to CPAP against a tighter 10% margin. That's a crucial distinction. High flow earns its place after extubation, not necessarily as the very first mode. Also in 2016, a Cochrane review pooling 15 studies and more than 1,700 infants found comparable efficacy overall, with less pneumothorax and less nasal trauma on high flow. Put it together, and today, high flow is accepted as a valid alternative to CPAP for preventing reintubation in most preterm babies. Let's distill the bottom line. Let's bring it home with the takeaways you can carry to the bedside. First, after extubation, high-flow nasal cannula is a reasonable alternative to CPAP for keeping very preterm babies off the ventilator. Second, the trade-off is honest. High-flow had a slightly higher failure rate, but it came with less nasal trauma and better tolerance, which matters for babies and families. Third, remember that about half of the high-flow failures were rescued by CPAP without reintubation. So if you're going to start with high-flow, keep CPAP ready as your next step. And fourth, be careful with the smallest babies, under 26 weeks. The trial simply didn't have the numbers to prove high flow is safe as first-line support there, so don't overextend the conclusion. Let's give the last word to the trialist. It's worth hearing the trialist reflect in his own words. Brett Manley was candid about the design. He acknowledged that the 20-point non-inferiority margin was generous and somewhat arbitrary. His reasoning was pragmatic. If more babies technically reached failure but suffered less nasal trauma, stayed more comfortable, and could usually be rescued by CPAP without harm, then high flow might still be an acceptable choice. That's the philosophy of a non-inferiority trial, stated plainly. On current practice, he described a nuanced approach that many units have adopted. They extubate the most premature babies to CPAP and the more mature ones straight to high flow. Then, once the tiniest babies are stable on low CPAP with modest oxygen, they transition them to high flow, and he notes how much parents and nurses appreciate that switch. Evidence and comfort, together. Let's close with the references. And here are the key references if you'd like to read further, anchored by the original Manley trial in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2013, alongside the Hypster trial and the Cochrane review that shaped how we interpret it today. Thanks for joining me for study number 18, the HIPERSPACE trial. The big lesson here isn't just about high flow versus CPAP. It's a clear, real-world example of how a non-inferiority trial works and what it can and can't tell us. I'm Dr. Adnan Hadid, and I'll see you in the next study.